Hello and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large, coming at you on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and here on YouTube with video. This week, I am bringing back a special guest that we had on just a few weeks ago, and that is Professor Steve Martin. We discussed language, and we discussed the manipulation of language, and this last week, there was a news story that mentioned the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, and how there were 7 words that were reportedly banned from use in the CDC. And that news story, of course, immediately came out with a shocking authoritarian headline that was very attention-grabbing, and I certainly had my attention grabbed by it. But, you know, then as we digged into the details of the story, it wasn't quite exactly as it appeared, and we'll get into the specifics of that later in the show. But it prompted Steve and I to, hey, we got more to talk about here on this, right? And I knew we were going to come back around on this because the manipulative use of language is something that is it's endlessly fascinating to me, for one. And it is a tool that is absolutely used by destructive cults. Loaded language is the term for it as it's used there. And we'll get into some of that also. So welcome, Steve, back to the Sensibly Speaking podcast.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for coming on. We've got a few things to cover. I kind of laid out a little bit of an outline. The first thing I wanted to do is you were on just a few weeks ago. Some of the comments you responded to from that podcast, but there were a couple that I thought maybe, you know, one or two that I thought people didn't quite get some of what we were talking about. You know, they listened.
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to thank everybody for watching and commenting. There was a lot of good dialogue and conversation and questions and advice and thoughts. That's what it's all about, because that helps me reevaluate what I'm thinking, and it helps my teaching and my scholarship too. So I want to thank your fans for commenting. So awesome. Yeah, I think one of them that you're probably referencing was I think someone said something to the effect of, you know, is it really manipulative?
Right.
Aren't people just, you know, communicating? And I think what's going on there with that question and that comment is that there's a pretty wide range of, I would say, how intentional it is that somebody is altering words or choosing their words, or in some cases completely redefining terms. And so there's a large continuum, a huge spectrum of this, from incredibly intentional and absolutely trying to manipulate and redefine a term to, you know, maybe people aren't even fully aware of it, and it's something that they're not even conscious of themselves, but it's still happening as well. So if what the person was saying is not all of this stuff is manipulative, of course I agree, but there also absolutely are instances where it's highly intentional. And in fact, as some commenters, there were some people who were aware, quite aware of the Frank Luntz person from watching, I think it was a PBS Frontline documentary called Hot Politics. I'm aware of that one as well, in which they walk you through how Frank Luntz focus groups people to come up with the right word. And of course, the classic example there from prior instances is the changing of the phrase estate tax to death tax. And lo and behold, what just happened? Congress and the Senate just passed a tax bill that basically cuts the estate tax in half and doesn't trigger it until twice as much money. So it used to trigger at like 5.5 million. Now it's 11.5 million. So a lot of revenue will be lost based on that particular change. So
that's
Frank
right.
Luntz, 20 years later, they've succeeded in that. So.
Well, exactly, and it is a long-term thing. You know, if you believe George Lakoff or however you say his name,
I think you're probably saying it right.
Yeah, I mean, George has been talking about this for years, and he said that you know, interested parties on the right in the conservative movement, going all the way back to the 1950s, set the framework in place for very intensive and very serious study of and use of language as a propaganda tool. in order to change the hearts and minds of the entire country. And when you work on something like that on a long term, you've got a lot of money to invest in something like that, and you hire, real professionals to do the work to figure out how do you communicate to people in such a way that you are not necessarily saying exactly what you mean, but you're saying what will get them on your side. This is pretty sneaky, manipulative stuff, and I don't know that we have that. I had a few commenters also mention, well, why don't you talk about how this is done on the left? And we did get into that a little bit, and of course they want more. Well, it's all about the and you go, okay, well, yeah, it does happen on the left, but I haven't been aware of or seen as active and professional an effort made by people on the left as has been done on the right.
I've been thinking about that a lot and I've had other conversations with people since our previous podcast as well. And I think one thing that's going on is that there's a little bit of what I would say is some confusion about the difference between so-called political correctness and manipulation of language. And is political correctness manipulating language? Sure. But I would also like to point out to people that I don't really equate these, because political correctness is asking us, for the most part, to respect people's differences, right? Like even gender pronouns. I think about this. If you always refer to a doctor as he and everything in writing is he, then people start to think that all doctors are male. And when you ask kids this, that they clearly think that as well. I got into a conversation with someone who said, well, I can't say faggot anymore, I get in trouble, or whatever. And that was the example that he used. And I said, so you're mad because you want to say faggot without getting in trouble at work or something like that. The government's not punishing anybody for saying swear words or bad words, but if your employer is, maybe it's because your employer doesn't want to have a hostile work environment and doesn't want people slinging around slurs at work when you're trying to sell Starbucks coffee to people. I mean,
right.
So I think people also really confuse, or maybe they don't understand what the First Amendment actually does protect us from and what it doesn't protect us from, and what a lot of this means. So if they're thinking of political correctness as the left manipulating language, I mean, it is.
Well, there's no question that it is.
Yeah. But I would also say that for the most part, that's because we're trying to, people don't want to be called a certain term. What's wrong with respecting that? I mean, and it's not that you don't get arrested if you call someone a faggot.
Well, no, it's not. It's a matter of social ostracism, and it's a matter of a social cost.
Absolutely.
And sometimes the social cost can appear rather high, right? I mean, you can be ostracized, blocked, and people have, when you are in a work environment where people are going to HR and reporting you for telling jokes or saying certain words that maybe 15 years ago were acceptable, right. Casual misogyny and casual racism are no longer as acceptable as they once were.
Right. And I consider that progress, frankly.
I get the point. I get the intention, but I will say that it can be taken too far, and I have seen some instances of that where it becomes, a bit of a black and white thinking sort of thing, and we do lose nuance.
Sure.
So, I think that some people on the right who look at that go, no, you're taking it too far, and there are examples of that where I'll go, yeah, okay, good. You're absolutely right. That instance, that was taken too far. But I do agree with your basic point that you're making, that there is an intention here in the use of or modification of language, that is potentially offensive to certain people. And it's kind of like, okay, well, if this is going to be a social issue, we're not making laws about this, but if we're going to make it a social issue, then let's,
and I would be, by the way, the first person to line up against a law like that, just so everybody's clear. And I do fight against that stuff. I do not believe it is the government's role to police language. Some examples of this stuff is, and this does kind of happen on both sides. There was kind of a viral something that went viral a while ago where there's a woman on the bike flipping off Trump's motorcade.
Yes.
Did you see that one? Remember that one? And she was fired from her job.
Which was completely not cool.
And
Yeah.
she also says that someone at the same company just prior to that was calling liberals a bunch of liberal fucktards or something, and he
Right.
was not fired and so forth. So, do you swear on your podcast?
Yeah, no, it's good.
We're not
we're
regulated by the FCC here, right? So,
no, we're good.
Not yet.
That's right. That's right. And we will get to that. All right. Well, I wanted to address a couple of those comments, and now I want to get into, just to get again, it wasn't. How do I put this? I have been getting some hate mail lately about, getting into politics. And I'm exaggerating. I haven't been getting hate mail. I've just been getting people who are a little sick and tired of, me spouting off sometimes about, from my unprofessional, ill-advised position, that I dare have opinions about, left and right and this sort of thing. Sorry folks, it's my channel. I'm going to talk about what I want to talk about. But, on this count, I do try to bring some balance. I'm not trying to be one of these, middle of the road, so let's get squished by both ends kind of people. I do tend to go over in the progressive direction, but I have always tried to make it clear that I'm willing to have, one, an open mind, and two, look at pros and cons on both ends of the political spectrum. And that's, my bottom line statement on that. Now, I wanted to go over with you before we get into the CDC stuff. I thought this would be relevant, and we didn't have time last time to get into this. I wanted to actually go over some L. Ron Hubbard with you.
Oh, okay.
Okay, because I talk all the time about cults and destructive cults and manipulative language, loaded language. We had a whole show about that. But this was an actual Scientology policy letter that Hubbard wrote in 1971, which is called Propaganda by Redefinition of Words.
Okay, that's what cults do.
Yeah, that's the name of the policy letter. Now, I'm not going to read the entire thing, but I do want to read some bits here because I wanted to get your feedback on it as a language professor. A long-term propaganda technique used by socialists, communists, and Nazis alike is of interest to PR practitioners. I know of no place it is mentioned in PR literature, but the data had verbal circulation in intelligence circles and is in constant current use. The trick is, words are redefined to mean something else to the advantage of the propagandist. A prime example is the word capitalist. Once it meant, quote, one who makes his income from the interest of loaning money to others. That is still the definition in economics. Through propaganda redefinition, a capitalist became a person of wealth who invested in business, making him an owner, not a banker, and currently is someone who exploits others, urges war, and stamps on workers. In short, the word is changing in meaning by the efforts of those who are trying to own everything in the country under the guise of being the worker's friend. Totalitarian socialism must eradicate the private owner in order to grab the property for themselves, hence an intense concentration on redefining the word capitalist and capitalism. And he goes on to say, many instances of this exist. Now that example is just Hubbard's example, and it's got some things about it that I would say yes to, and some things about it I would say, yeah, no fucking way to. But that's the example is just one thing. The intent of this policy is what I really wanted to focus on here. He says many instances of this exist. They are not quote unquote natural changes in language. They are propaganda changes, carefully planned and campaigned in order to obtain a public opinion advantage for the group doing the propaganda. Now that sounds exactly like what Lakoff is talking about.
Sure. Actually, as I was thinking about a lot of that, one came to mind in between since we talked last was the phrase entitlement. Mm-hmm. The word entitlement to refer to, in particular, Social Security and Medicare and programs that we pay into for 40 or 50 years before we're eligible to get them. I would actually call them something like a deferred earned program or something. I mean, but the word entitlement if you look up the definition, right, the first definition of it is quite literal, and it says you're entitled to, it's yours by right. And that's true. I paid in. I don't know about you. I've been paying into Social Security and Medicare so far for about nearly 30 years.
Yep.
And so, yeah, I absolutely am entitled. It's a promise that has been made to me, right, that I get Medicare when I turn 65, because the private for-profit insurance market is certainly not going to cover me. That's not profitable. They're not going to cover 65 and older people. That's why Medicare exists. It wouldn't work. But when the GOP says this phrase, they're saying it pejoratively.
That's right.
As in your entitlement, in the sense that it's a handout. Or that you feel entitled to this, but you're really not.
That's right.
So they've really redefined Medicare and Social Security and programs like that. Now, there are different social welfare programs that would fall into perhaps the category of their pejorative meaning of entitlement, like maybe the SNAP program, food stamps and things like that. But defining it that way and meaning it pejoratively is meant to suggest that we have that the American public doesn't have a right to it, when in fact that is our money. Take a look at how much we've been paying into that for our entire lives, and I better have Medicare there for me when I'm 65, because if I don't, I'm screwed. So
right.
I was thinking about that one particular word has a lot to unpack, and it's a really good example of a lot of what you were just talking about. It goes along the lines of what you're talking about with various social economic systems and policies and so forth. So that one really occurred to me as something that the Republicans in particular are really trying to redefine. And I think Democrats should, in this case, if I was giving advice, should say it absolutely is an entitlement, but we mean this by that, or start using a different phrase. It's a deferred.
Well, that's what ends up
deferred income or something.
Well, exactly. That's what ends up happening is you have to actually come up with different language for it, because once you've poisoned the well, so to speak, once you've made the word a bad word, it becomes really difficult to take it back. Another word that to me has a lot of difficulty getting it across to people is privilege. Specifically like white privilege, right? You start talking about white privilege, and people, poor or middle class, white people who don't particularly feel privileged, because they take this word and associate it with something like aristocracy or royalty or something. And that's not at all what this means. But it's really hard to get that across.
In that context at all.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, that's aided and abetted by right-wing propaganda, which plays to that misunderstanding of privilege, right?
Sure.
Okay, so
they've redefined it as a special right, not an equal right.
Exactly.
As in you get more of it or something.
Yeah. Okay, so then he says, Hubbard, just to get back to Hubbard here, just to give another example of something that I think people will key into a little bit easier than the capitalist thing. Hubbard says the technique, this business of redefining words, the technique is good or bad depending on the ultimate objective of the propagandist. Okay, I don't agree with that, but this is what Hubbard is saying. For example, and Scientology's done this, psychiatry and psychiatrist as words are easily redefined to mean an antisocial enemy of the people. That's because Hubbard hated psychiatry, right?
Oh, well.
He hated it.
Because they disproved everything he said.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I imagine he did.
Oh yeah, no, he was knocking the competition, right? So this takes the kill crazy psychiatrist off the preferred list of professions. This is a good use of the technique, as for a century, the psychiatrist has been setting an all-time record for inhumanity to man. The redefinition of words is done by associating different emotions and symbols with the word than were intended. Two things occur because of this. The Scientologists are redefining doctor, psychiatry, and psychology to mean undesirable antisocial elements, and are trying to stabilize the actual meaning of Scientology. So, so he's here bemoaning the fact that, you know, this technique is used against Scientology, he thinks, which it actually wasn't, while they are actively using this technique to try to knock the competition and take psychiatry out. I mean, Scientology is very clear about the fact that they want to eradicate psychiatry from the face of the planet. They don't want to get along with psychiatry. They don't want to tolerate psychiatry. They want it gone. And Hubbard is recommending in this policy that this technique is a powerful tool to go about doing that. And that was something I just wanted to point out because it's a public policy. You can dig this up. You can find it. It's not, you know, you kind of have to look a little bit, but this is not, you know, they're not being bashful about what they're doing, you know. And I thought that this might apply in other circles as well. That's why I wanted to kind of get your take on, you know, what do you think about an organization that has this technique as a policy, as an operating standard for how the organization should be run?
Well, I mean, that seems fairly common operating procedure for most religions and cults. You know, if psychiatry and psychology are the main scientific methods to debunk most of what Hubbard claims as the beliefs of Scientology, then naturally you want to get rid of those forces that you know are evidence against your claims. I don't think it's entirely different than the relationship between most religions and science in general, frankly. We still see this. I think that, well, we could start talking about the CDC thing for a minute. Right?
Well, yeah, we're going to roll. We are going to transition into that. We're going to roll right into that. Yeah, I wanted. Could you explain a little bit more about what you're just talking about, though, because I'm not quite sure I actually see it the same way in terms of what religion. I mean, that's a very broad term, and I'd like to be more specific. So, because you know, because there are people who listen to this show who are religious believers, and I'm not out to tell them that their brand of organized religion is inherently evil and must be destroyed. You know, because there are some bad actors, whether in their faith or other religious faiths. So I want to be clear about how have you seen this done in a religious setting or from a religious group?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at the entire history of most major religions, they were at some point in time incredibly at odds with science, right? And then they found ways to adapt and say, oh yeah, you're right. So 7 days, God didn't really create it in 7 human days, right? There's still young Earth creationists though. So I'm talking about those sorts of sects of Christianity.
Yeah,
I'm not necessarily talking about the sort of more liberal takes on Christianity or the you know, like the Catholic Church realized at some point, again, I was raised Catholic, so I follow this stuff as well. At some point, the Vatican decided, oh, we better make an official statement that indeed we do actually understand and accept evolution as scientific fact. And why did they do that? They did that because for centuries they were saying evolution was bogus. But when the scientific evidence became overwhelmingly, you know, confirmatory of evolution being a scientific fact, the Catholic Church officially said, we better accept this or we're going to lose all of our members who are going to think of us as unscientific and against science, in fact. So I don't really know if I have a real definitive line about what's a cult from a religion, frankly, because the difference seems to me to be how big it is.
Oh, I see. Well, let me.
When are you not a cult? You're not a cult any longer when you have 1 million followers. But
yeah, that's not it.
No, that's. You realize now. No, you realize that a lot of Christians call Mormonism a cult, Scientology a cult. Well, and in fact, there's other Christian Science is a cult. I was just looking at a website from someone claiming to be a Christian now, which I don't know exactly what sect of Christianity this person was, but he identified all of those as cults.
Yeah,
they're dangerous cults because they're redefining Christian terms, and it's like, well, I mean, in some ways, every Christian. Why are there 30 some odd thousand different versions of Christianity? It's because they all have a different set of doctrines and dogma that they embrace and that they reject, and so At some point, it's almost like you're a cult if you have enough members to be legitimate enough to not be called a cult.
Yeah, that's not it. But I do understand the confusion and the upset about it. And people do get quite upset about these things. And there are schisms, right? There are cuts, there are breaks that occur with different groups. This has happened all throughout history. I mean, Protestants, Lutherans, et cetera, right?
Right.
That's not what makes a group a cult. A cult is actually a pretty studied and pretty precise thing. But it comes down to, I mean, the easy way to explain it, after, all the years that I've been spending studying this stuff, is a cult is an abusive relationship. Whether it's 2 people or 2 million people, it doesn't matter. And the belief system doesn't matter. It has nothing to do with the beliefs, right? That's not what makes a cult a cult. A cult is an abusive relationship between a leader and follower or followers. And to the degree that there is abuse, to the degree that there are undue influence, lies, viciousness, violence, etc., perpetrated on the followers by the leader, that's the degree that you have a destructive cult. And that's really the simplicity of it, which is why not all religion is a destructive cult, or not all religious groups are cults. It doesn't work that way. They're not all bad for you. But there,
I was more mentioning the fact that it's a strange line to draw. What I was seeing on this some other websites, that it's the redefining of terms or something that makes it a cult, right? I'm actually disagreeing with that. I think that
that's right.
That's not what it is, and there certainly are sociological definitions of how you draw a line from a cult to other things, no doubt about it. And I don't study cults specifically. I had someone in my community reach out to me who was a former ex-Jehovah's Witness, a former Jehovah's Witness, and she was interested in learning a bunch of other stuff. And I don't really know that much about Jehovah's Witnesses, but she was telling me how she would definitely describe that as a cult.
Yes,
and I think that's one of those that's kind of a gray. I don't know. I mean, I don't know enough about it to speak definitively here at all. I'm not pretending to, but from her perspective, it absolutely was. And where she seemed to be making a line, I guess it's pretty similar to what you're saying in terms of it being abusive, in the sense that they do a lot of very overt shunning and ostracizing, and very controlling about who you can befriend. You're really not supposed to be friends with anybody outside of the Jehovah's Witness. I didn't know that.
Yep.
That seems to be sort of a hallmark of a cult, right?
That's right.
You almost have to like divorce yourself from everybody who's not an in-group member. I don't know if Scientology is quite that extreme, is it? But
no, it is.
It is, okay.
Oh yeah, no. The us versus them thing
that seems to be a big factor.
Big factor in that. Yeah, definitely a big factor, because that's a destructive thing to do. It's not a constructive thing to get people into an exclusive bubble world type environment, and that's one of the things cults do to generate that. And Jehovah's,
and a big way they do that is through language, right?
Yes, and that's another tool, exactly. Which is why I wanted to read from Hubbard's policy directly, where it's like he's not even being bashful about it. This is what we're going to do, because this is how you shape people's hearts and minds. Very, very powerful tool.
And Scientology was they seem to be almost corporate in their public relations. Like they had they had official PR people, and yes. I don't know what the title of it was, but they had official people that's their job. Their job was to manage media, public relations, just like a corporation would. And that's a little bit, I would say, somewhat unusual for religions to have that, even cults.
Oh, I no, that's not unusual. No, you don't think so? Oh no. No, if you okay, let me put it this way. If you think the Pope is making any of his pronouncements,
well, no, I agree.
Right? Without running it through some PR firms first?
I agree with you.
Yeah. And I'm not, pointing at you, how dare you, Steve, you ignorant fool. I just mean, in general, there is a lot more PR influence in our world than people have any suspicion of. And that's why this is such an important subject for me, is because I have peeked behind that curtain. And there's, when you do, you are shocked at the legion of public relations people who stand behind the curtain of, you know, one or two or three people that you think they're just up there talking, or they have a speechwriter or something, and you don't know that hundreds or even thousands of hours of work that have gone into crafting.
Oh, they're certainly there.
You know, speeches or positions. I was just thinking,
like Scientology seems to have, they actually give the person the title.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're really blatant. That's what I meant. Like, they're really overt about it. They're really blatant about it. I don't know. Well, maybe, I mean, the Vatican might specifically have a PR person because it's the Vatican, but probably, you know, typically, like, there's not a spokesperson for Lutheranism.
Oh, there probably is if you went looking for it.
I don't think they have a post. I don't know. Maybe there is. I don't know. I could be totally wrong.
No, I get your point, and you're not wrong. That's right.
They certainly serve that function.
That's right. The function's always there. The title of it might be itself a bit of language manipulation. You know,
very well could be.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's go ahead and roll into this CDC thing, because
sure.
This, I just, you know, again, I want to connect dots, right? And you know, Scientology is one of the most destructive of the destructive cults that are out there. I mean, short of the violent extremists like the, you know, Al Qaeda or ISIS or something like that. You know, in terms of, you know, not overtly violent and yet still very mentally, emotionally, and psychologically destructive. That Scientology is at the top of the list. I try to connect dots between what Scientology is doing and what I see being done in the world at large. Because the more time I've spent reacclimating to the real world, having lived in a bubble world until 4 years ago, and the more I'm learning about things, and the more I, you know, am bringing my perspective to stuff that is, I'm a 48-year-old man who has a relatively fresh perspective on the big wide world because I was in such a bubble world for so long. So I look at some of what was going on in Scientology, and then I look at the things that are going on in government on the left and the right, or what goes on in corporations. I don't care what the corporation is. I see it. I see these cult techniques and tactics being used. And specifically here, we had this news story now. And in case anybody isn't familiar with this, Steve, go ahead and say what was the story this last week on this?
Oh, well, I mean, the original story, I think, and I was a little suspicious of it at first. I even, in a few cases, posted, like, let's hold on, let's not jump on this just yet.
Yep.
But it was essentially that someone, presumably the Trump administration at some level or some person, had prohibited or banned 7 words from appearing in CDC or the Center for Disease Control reports.
Oh, and those words were entitlement, diversity, vulnerable, transgender, science-based, evidence-based, and fetus. Those were the 7 words.
Right. And so I was a little bit suspicious at first, but then I had some stories that confirmed it. But I think what I think our best knowledge right now is that what happened is, and what, you know, you might never be able to trace back the original source of who said what to whom, because in an organization, these things this was internal parts of meetings that people were communicating. I've worked on grants and other funding, and I've tried to secure money both from governmental sources like the National Science Foundation and from private foundations of all kinds of various foundations to help fund programs at my college and things like that. And, you know, you do have to be mindful of using the language that they want to hear. And so this goes back to maybe how we opened up the episode here is, you know, where do you draw a line between adapting your language on the one hand to your audience to be more appealing to them, to be more likely to be persuasive and convincing and compelling to them? You know, it is a form of manipulation, don't get me wrong, versus, you know, censorship and outright manipulation. So what I think is going on here, and I don't know if we'll ever know the full truth, but just putting all of that together, someone probably inside the CDC said, we need to watch the way that we write our budget proposals because we currently have a Republican Congress who is going to react negatively to words like diversity, evidence-based, science-based. So try to tone that down, because the fewer of those words we use, the more likely we are to get the funding that we need to conduct the research that we need. So I don't really think that anybody from on high is banning or prohibiting words. So it's maybe not an example of Orwellian type censorship, but I would also, dear viewer, say it's not any better. Right. Because what this is actually saying is, I think, possibly even worse for humanity, frankly, because now what people are saying is we have elected a majority in Congress who don't actually value science itself, science-based research. I don't know what other kind of research there is necessarily, I guess. I mean, there's evidence, you know,
yeah. Evidence-based.
The word,
I mean,
guess where this word, and I did a little more digging, the word fetus, where did that appear in previous CDC budget proposals? It appeared in research about the Zika virus.
Right.
Which affects human development at the fetal stage. So we do need to understand that. And, you know, fetus is a scientific term about a developmental stage of human life inside of the uterus. So we have to be precise with our language. And so what this is, and obviously what is that? Well, that's a right-wing pro-life trigger word. I actually got into this conversation with somebody and like, it's not a fetus, it's a baby. And I'm like, well, okay, but there's different stages at which it's
a baby.
We refer to it this way, you know, or it's a potential human life or something. I'm like, yeah. I get it. I understand the values. I get it. But
unborn child, unborn human.
But there were people celebrating this. They were saying good for, because they bought into it too, by the way. It wasn't just left-wing people who fell for the story. There were people on the right who were saying good for Trump. He should ban those words. So it really was, you know, I mean, there were people celebrating that it was a prohibition of these words on the CDC, and they were saying, well, that's good because a fetus is, you know, a word. I don't want the word fetus used. So that happened.
Wow.
But so what I really think is going on there is it's someone internal to the CDC, perhaps the director of it or someone a few steps below that person saying, if we want to get the money we need from a budget proposal process to research the topics we need to research so that something like a Zika virus doesn't spread in the United States and elsewhere, just use these words less frequently because for Republicans, they're trigger words, right?
Wow.
They trigger them immediately. And diversity, that absolutely is a trigger word to, I mean, I see this quite a bit actually, that they don't, diversity to them is a dirty word. It's like it's not a good thing.
Right.
Diversity is not a good thing. So
see, and I'm not down with banning any of this because I'm thinking to myself right now, well, you know, there could be people watching this right now going, yeah, but you lefties ban all kinds of words all the time. In fact, you guys were talking about it at the beginning of the show. You know, you can't use, you know, this word or that word or the N word or the C word or all these other words that are offensive to people and socially ostracizing. And my response is I wouldn't support any kind of official ban on any of those words either. In no way, shape, or form would I ever want anyone to feel that they could not, that it would somehow violate a law to say those words.
I mean, I got to make that difference. So this is another example. Twitter just banned the accounts of some violent radical Islamist groups that were the one that Trump actually retweeted. Twitter banned that account, and someone had commented, "Oh, that's that's censorship. It's the end of freedom." And I'm like, it's Twitter. Twitter's a private company. They're not the government, and I don't think people understand the difference. It's fundamental to understanding where, in particular, me as a admittedly more progressive person, I don't want the government to ban that, but Twitter can. It's their platform. It's their technology. It's a private for-profit company. They can ban anybody, any word that they want. That's their right to do that, and the government can't tell them not to. So if the government stepped in and said, Twitter, no, you have to allow these people to have Twitter accounts, that's where there's a problem.
Right.
That's a violation of the First Amendment. And so what I find over and over and over again is a fundamental misunderstanding of what the First Amendment actually does and what it doesn't do, who it protects and who it protects from. It protects you as an individual or you as a company from the government. And so I don't want the government to ban any words. None. Zero. None.
That's right.
But I also say if I own a company and I've got 50 employees and my employees are walking around with when I have customers in the store calling each other faggots and the N-word, and okay, no, it's my company.
Right.
You're fired. And I have every damn right to fire a person at my company who's walking around calling other people faggots. And I just don't think people are getting the dynamics and the there's a lot going on here. And now, do the progressives and liberals not want those words to be said? Sure, because what they're trying to say is consider other people's feelings. No one's banning it, but maybe it's a bad idea to go around calling people the N-word.
Right.
Possibly, maybe rethink that. I don't know.
Right.
It might be wise to not go around saying that for your own benefit as well. I mean, you can still say it by all means.
Well, it's really it's really a matter of empathy and compassion. I mean, if you're really want to make, okay, what's the core of this argument, right? You can go First Amendment. I can say anything, anywhere, anytime. Yeah, you absolutely can. And if you come on, I don't know, public platforms, and you say these things, you're going to upset some people. So there's a cost-benefit ratio you need to take into account, right? Which is, is it of more benefit to you, or is there more of a cost to it? But that's not a legal point. It's a social point, right?
That's right.
And,
yes.
That's
very
really,
big distinction.
Yeah, it's a huge distinction, right? So,
and I just think that gets all messed up and conflated, and people get a little bit, like, liberals are not allowing me to say this word. Well, where? I mean, you can say it, but expect to lose a lot of friends and maybe your job if your employer doesn't like it.
Exactly.
And unless your employer is the government, in most states, you could be fired for any reason whatsoever.
Yeah.
And now I don't necessarily agree with that, but the point is that's actually a conservative position. They want companies to be able to fire anybody at any time for any reason.
Right.
And most bosses are smart enough not to say I fired you because you're gay, because then that's not okay, right? That's
right.
But they're not gonna say that.
Right.
They're not gonna come out and tell you that that's the reason, even if it is. But. Right.
Yeah, it really does come down to a point of sensitivity, compassion, empathy. Right? You either, and everybody's endowed with those qualities to one degree or another on a spectrum. And hopefully we can, I think the main point that's being made by progressives, like you just said, is can we please have some recognition of what other people in the world, that other people in the world exist, it's not just you, and, and two, could you perhaps show them some degree of respect by addressing them or talking to them in the way that they would feel comfortable being.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they understand that. If I kept using a term to describe them and they didn't like it and I kept doing it, that at some point, not only is it disrespectful, but it also almost becomes even more so than that. Like if I keep calling, I don't even want to come up with an example, but if you keep calling a particular person a particular word and they say, hey, you know what, I really don't like being called that, could you stop? And I keep doing it, it's pretty clear you're just you're harassing them at that point, or you're just being a jerk. You're being a jerk. So all that progressives are saying about the political correctness stuff is maybe you should reconsider being a jerk because those people do not like that label. Anyway, but I'm not beating a dead horse here, but
no,
there's a big difference between that and a government banning the word and like putting you in prison because you say the word faggot. That's not what's happening here. No one's being imprisoned. No one's getting fined.
Exactly. Exactly. And also I think, there's the social cost that has to be paid. And I think that is kind of coming into its own in a way because we I think some people don't want it to become a legal issue, and yet they want some kind of cost to be there for this kind of behavior, for this intolerant, unsocial behavior, and so the cost has become a social cost. I mean, you see, even to the point of the sexual harassers and abusers, and they're paying. They're not. Nobody's taken Louis C.K. to court, as far as I know.
I don't think so.
I don't know if Weinstein's going to court or not. I mean, I'd be a little bit surprised if he wasn't, but given the severity of some of the allegations against him. But not all these guys.
Most of them aren't, because it would.
Nobody's taking Kevin Spacey to court with the idea that they're going to throw him in prison for what he did, and yet he has paid a tremendous price for his bad behavior, right? For his abusive behavior. Lost his job, his career, who knows? We'll see if he even if there is any coming back from this. So that's a cost, and it's a legitimate form of social protest against bad behavior.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So, but we got to really see that this is on all sides of this. This is human behavior. You know what I mean? It's not really, I wish it would be great if we could get past the left and right labels and specific examples and look at the fact that people on the left do this and people on the right do this. And people on the left don't like it and people on the right don't like it. You don't want to be called a snowflake. You don't want to be called a libtard. Well, you also don't want to be called a homophobe and a misogynist and a racist if that's not where you're coming from, Right. And that's a big complaint on the right, is that the left keeps labeling them, well, you support Trump, therefore you're a racist. That is a logical fallacy. There's no truth connected with that equation, right? You have to take each individual, and you have to dig down into the details of, well, why did you vote for Trump? And then you'll find out that it actually is something completely different and had nothing to do with his position on immigration, So the guys on the left get into just as much trouble with this crap,
that stuff, absolutely,
by doing that, and it's pretty silly. Now, I wanted to ask you though, let's dive back into the CDC thing just to finish this off totally.
Yeah. I actually have something,
because I don't know that people totally outside academia. And if I hadn't dived into some academic papers and done some academic criticisms or critiques on my channel here of some Scientology stuff, I don't know that I would know anything about this. We don't have to explain the whole thing with grant processes and all that, but talk a little bit more about why language is important and why grants and the CDC, like why is this important at all?
The CDC itself, or the
grant process, like this, like we're talking here about, words that have been highly suggested to not be used. Yes. Let's put it that way. In the CDC. Well, the CDC is a science-based group that requires money and to operate, right?
Yeah, I mean, they have to do budget requests every year for particular, and I don't know the details of it, specifically the CDC, but they've got to have a rough idea of what they need funding for, what they're going to study, and why they need to study it, why it matters. And just as one example of all of this, what did come out of it that seems to be being reported accurately is that instead of saying science-based, and I'll get the exact words here. I actually wrote this one down because I felt like this one is really important because it's another concept I could introduce and talk about.
Yeah.
That the CDC bases its recommendation on, and here I'm quoting, science in consideration with community standards and wishes.
Yes.
Okay, so
thank you for bringing that up.
This is a little bit problematic because, so if you go back to ancient Greek rhetorical theory, actually, there was a concept called doxa, which is doxa. And doxa is essentially another way of saying that you're appealing to public opinion. And it's also another way of it's a fallacy, right? It's ad populum. It's an appeal to popularity. So you'll see people appeal to that all the time, as if polling data should control everything, right? And obviously that's often a very bad idea. But this is actually not an insignificant move based on language. Now, again, I don't want to be too overly concerned. I don't want to say that. I don't want to be Chicken Little here. Say the sky is falling. We're not going to do any scientific research anymore. But this is basically it's pandering to the current. And again, I don't want to make it left right, but the fact is, right now our federal government is controlled at all three levels by the GOP: President, Senate, and House. And the Supreme Court leans kind of conservative too. So even if you go to the other branches, that's not a real great move for science because it's sort of unscientific, right? It's saying this would be like saying, well, we recommend vaccinating people But if you really don't like that, it's okay too, because it's the community's wishes. So, and what has happened as a result of some of that, if we're talking about vaccination, for example, well, now you got pockets of the country where some pretty some diseases that we have just about eradicated are making a comeback, and that's really scary. There's parts of Texas, for example, where you're starting to see a lot of whooping cough and various strains of the mumps coming back, and that's because of they took into consideration community standards and wishes.
Right.
And you know what? The CDC shouldn't, I would argue, shouldn't. That's not what it's about. It's about the best findings of science. And, you know, you need to have a certain percentage of the population vaccinated against particular diseases to achieve herd immunity. And there are certain parts of the country now, because of religious exemptions, sorry to bring it back to that, but that's one of them. And the vaccination one, here you go. I'm equal opportunity basher. There are tons of stupid liberals out there. Sorry, guys. Vaccinations are essential, and it's a weird issue where there's people kind of on the far right and on the far left who, for different like, I don't know, far right, maybe they think it's a conspiracy where the government is like implanting them with something in the
Yeah, the
vaccination.
Alex Jones crowd.
Yeah, and then there's the sort of uber natural David Avocado wolf following liberal hippies who don't understand. So I'll bash liberals here, and this sort of, you know, and then together they're not getting vaccinated, or they're not getting their kids vaccinated, and we're begging for a big problem here. We're going to start seeing some diseases come back that were pretty much gone for the most part, and I think people misunderstand the science there. And that's one of my biggest concerns, is that we must maintain that we base our decisions on evidence. And that's, I mean, it's basically that, evidence. We need to base our decisions on evidence, the best available evidence that we have. Maybe we're wrong. We find out something else tomorrow, we make a discovery, then we should alter our belief based on that new evidence, rather than maintaining a belief in spite of all available best evidence. And that's what we're seeing here. This is a move that we're trying to appease the GOP, some parts of them, not all of them, that, oh, well, you don't believe in climate. We go back to climate change, right? By the way, this has already been happening. The EPA has very much sanitized its website of the phrase climate change, and now instead uses the phrase extreme weather. So they've replaced a lot of the instances of climate change with the phrase extreme weather. So we are seeing this in other parts of the government too. It's not just the CDC story, and that happened shortly after Trump appointed Scott Pruitt to head to EPA as well. So it's not just happening in the CDC. So there is cause for concern here still, even though, yes, that story was a little bit blown out of proportion. I certainly wouldn't think of it as anybody from on high banning words, although there's probably significant pressure to use these words less frequently. And that's still problematic. So right. I don't want to say that I don't think it's a nothing burger, so to speak.
No, it's not. There is
still some. Yeah, I think there's still something that we really need to be concerned about as a society here, even if it's not the Orwellian ban on some words that we maybe the stories initially made it sound like. It's still problematic.
Well, it's Orwellian, and it's not. You know, there's a couple. Well, and here's why. There's a couple factors to Orwellian behavior or Orwellian control systems. One of them is getting rid of words entirely. If the word doesn't exist, then supposedly the thought doesn't exist or the concept doesn't exist, right?
That's true.
That's one way of controlling a conversation or controlling a subject or controlling a population. Because we're really ultimately talking about what Orwellian control is population control. This isn't a one-on-one thing so much. So yeah, you get rid of words, and within a generation or two, supposedly the idea itself has gone. Which is not to say that somebody else couldn't come up with the same idea again, because some of these ideas are fairly universal in concept, like liberty, freedom, you know, this kind of things, happiness. But you could theoretically do that. And when we talk about bans on words, like the CDC story that was so alarming to begin with, that would be an example of that kind of a control mechanism. Now, another part of this, though, and a much more insidious one, and I think the one we've probably been talking more about, is redefining words, right? Changing the use of words. This is a much more covert method of control, because you take an idea that means one thing and then you change it over into something else using the same terminology. and that's, you know, that's what's, so we have the first use, we have the first thing, banning words, by no longer being able to say climate change. That's gone. That's off the websites. You know, Rick Scott in Florida, I shall not ever hear this word cross my path in any way, right? I mean, the ultimate in denialism, right? Thank you, Rick Scott in Florida, right? Who's going to be the first affected in this country. Moron.
He should rethink that.
Yeah, he should really think that. So that's an example of that. But here, where, you know, there's this much more subtle thing, and it's not just in politics. You know, politicians have more power than your average Joe, and the decisions that they make affect more people than your average Joe's decisions, which I think is why we harp on the power of politics, or why this sort of thing goes on in the political sphere. If IBM banned, you know, transgender, well, that would really suck for everybody at IBM, but it wouldn't affect Joe Schmo in Montana. When a government agency is banning a word or is changing the definitions of words, now we're talking about something that potentially could affect everybody, and that's why I think we get a lot more outrage about it and upset about it.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I saw this and I was like, this is literally what George Orwell wrote about, you know, when I saw this story.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, I guess I was thinking of it in the sense of an outright ban, and it's not that. But, you know, in a lot of ways, it still operates pretty similarly to that. Even if the personnel at the CDC are self-censoring, so to speak, it's still problematic. And so I know already, I can already imagine this is going to get called fake news, and everyone's going to act like it's not happening and it doesn't matter. But I really would implore people to realize the fact that this really still does matter, even though, yes, the Washington Post probably overplayed the headline. Yeah. And, you know, but I'm not too surprised by that, because headlines are always overplayed.
I mean, what they're saying is that
I wish they wouldn't have done it, though, because it just gives another excuse to say, oh, that liberal media is misrepresenting this. And it's unfortunate when the media do that. They really should have. But, you know, sometimes the headline doesn't capture the article. And a lot of these articles, they do actually explain exactly what we're just talking about. If people would read past the first sentence.
Well, that's the thing, is that
the whole story is there.
Exactly. And the word banned was apparently a quote from the source. From the Washington Post source. I mean, it was a report last Friday, and it was an unnamed analyst. And he said, and he said that there was a meeting.
Not supposed to talk to the public.
Yeah, well, you know, said there was a meeting on Thursday, and unnamed officials told CDC workers that they were, quote unquote, banned from using those 7 words. So that's where the story got its legs from. And
you know, I tell my students all the time that they're strongly encouraged to attend a particular event, and it pretty much means they're required to do it.
Right.
And they know that.
Yeah. You were strongly encouraged.
When your boss tells you that you're strongly encouraged to not use a word, there's a very fine line there between outright ban. I mean, people know what is being said, and then later on, the person has plausible deniability. You're like, I didn't really ban it. I just strongly encourage you not to say it. I was going to fire you if you used it, but
right.
So, you know, there's a lot of fine lines here that I don't think the story is not as overblown now as what it's going to end up sounding like. Frankly, it actually does matter.
I agree with you. That's the main thing, is that this, whether we take a great big fake news stamp and stamp this story with that, you know, that would not be a good idea, because this kind of manipulation of language, even if it's just in grant writing, you know, it matters. It creates a climate of censorship and manipulation, and
definitely matters.
And really the bottom line on this, I think, is it creates a climate of untruth. And when you're in a science-based, evidence-based situation, that's what, right? Which are 2 of the words that were banned. You cannot allow an authoritarian control system to tell you what is and isn't truth.
Yeah.
You know, or and by truth, I mean that in a relative sense, because I understand science is not truth. Science is about observations and observing what you observe and figuring out potential on a scale, percentage wise, potential reasons why those observations are the way that they are. That's truth in science, right? I get it. Okay.
I know you're going to get into some big epistemological debate.
I know. I'm always going to have some commenter,
but it's truth. You know,
but truth is, as differentiated from, say, faith. Okay.
Yes. Absolutely. Exactly.
Right. So, we don't want that when we're talking about when lives are at stake. Right. That's the real issue here. And,
exactly.
And this kind of thing does threaten lives. And
Absolutely.
So if we don't want to see lives being threatened, then we need to be paying attention to this. It actually is that important.
It is.
So, all right. So that's those were the things. Steve, thank you for being on here. We're running out of time. Yeah. No, this was fun.
Yeah, the time goes so fast. How does that happen?
I know. But I think we covered some good stuff, and I'm definitely, again, interested in anybody's feedback on all of the things we went over here. Throw it at us, good, bad, or sideways. I tried as best I could to predict some of what was going to come and head it off. Not because I'm trying to shut you guys up out there. I actually love it when I get, all kinds of feedback from you. I just want it to be feedback based on what we're actually saying and not necessarily what you are sort of thinking we're saying through some, left or right-wing biases or that kind of thing. But we can duke it out in the comment section. So go ahead and leave it there. I'm sure, Steve will come around again.
And, that was fun, guys. Appreciated it.
Absolutely. Okay, cool. Now, again, how do people reach you?
If you want, you could put my email in the section if you want, or I'll watch the comments there. I think I linked my Ripon profile on a few people's. If you want to put that on there, you can too. But so they can find it. Or I'll put it on there if someone really wants to. I'll be watching the comments. That's
Great.
Probably the best way to
Okay, good. All right. So you guys can interact with Steve and me.
Yeah.
And thank you very much for listening to the show here. Steve, thanks for being on board.
Thanks again,
absolutely. And we will see you guys next week. Bye-bye.